You're listening to Trace Hunt Radio. We explore the darkest chapters of true crime, unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and the twisted minds behind them. Follow the blood, chase the clues, uncover the truth. Stay sharp. The hunt begins now.
Carnivals are meant to dazzle, glowing lights against the night sky, music floating through the air, and the thrill of games and rides pulling crowds into a temporary world of wonder. But for one traveling carnival in the late 1950s, the Big Top became something else entirely: a tomb. When fire swept through the tents in a matter of minutes, panicked reports called it a tragedy. An accident born of gasoline lamps and canvas too dry to withstand a spark. Families mourned what they thought was fate. But decades later, when redevelopment crews unearthed the carnival grounds, they found something the fire had not erased. Fragments of bone, human teeth, and personal effects buried in the ash. Forensic testing revealed the truth no one had wanted to believe. Not everyone died in the flames. Some were already dead before the fire began. What investigators uncovered was not a simple accident, but a cover-up. The Carnival of Ashes was hiding a string of murders, its flames deliberately set to mask the truth. Who was responsible? Was it the ringmaster desperate to silence blackmail? The fortune-teller with secrets of her own? Or someone else hiding behind grease paint and spectacle? Tonight, we pull back the curtain on Murder Under the Big Top, where joy turned to terror, and the carnival's final act was murder. The carnival had rolled into town with the same fanfare as always. Painted wagons creaking along the dirt road, colorful posters slapped on brick walls, promising wonders that would only last until the weekend. For a few nights each year, the carnival transformed an ordinary fairground into a stage of lights, laughter, and illusion. On this summer evening in 1958, families crowded through the entrance arch, coins clinking in pockets, children tugging at their parents' sleeves, eager for the rides, the games, and the promise of cotton candy under the stars. The air smelled of popcorn and gasoline lamps, of fried sweets and the musk of caged animals that stirred uneasily at the edge of the grounds. Under the Big Top, the ringmaster's booming voice rose above the noise. "Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, the show is about to begin." He wore a crimson coat trimmed with brass buttons, his top hat gleaming under the lantern light. A band struck up a jaunty tune while acrobats stretched. Clowns painted fresh smiles, and the crowd filled the wooden bleachers that circled the ring. The canvas ceiling above them rippled slightly in the summer breeze, its seams patched from years of travel, smelling faintly of pitch and oil. The show began with practiced rhythm. Tumblers launched through the air, clowns stumbled in choreographed chaos. A lion roared from its cage, answered by applause that shook the tent poles. Children squealed with delight, parents smiled, and the ringmaster fed off their energy, promising greater thrills in the acts yet to come. Outside the tent, food vendors hawked roasted peanuts and glowing candied apples, while barkers shouted for games of chance. To the crowd, it was a night of magic. To the carnival folk, it was routine. Then, sometime after 8 o'clock, a flicker appeared near the eastern edge of the canvas, where a lantern hung too close to the cloth. At first it was nothing, a thin wisp of smoke curling upward, barely noticed over the noise of the band. A child pointed, laughing, thinking it was part of the show. But within seconds, the smoke thickened. The flame bit through the canvas, and a sheet of fire raced across the roof like lightning, feeding on years of oil and resin that had soaked into the fabric. panic surged instantly. The audience screamed as sparks rained down, igniting wooden benches and scattering straw. Mothers clutched children, fathers shoved toward exits that suddenly seemed far too narrow. Performers dropped character in an instant, clowns tearing off masks, acrobats scrambling for ropes. But the fire moved faster than any of them. The band's music broke into discordant shouts as instruments clattered to the floor. Eyewitnesses later described the sound. A roar, louder than the animals, louder than the crowd. A living thing that devoured air and replaced it with heat. The canvas ceiling collapsed in sections, raining fire on those beneath. In the chaos, some were trampled, others overcome by smoke. The exits jammed with bodies pushing, clawing, desperate to escape. Outside, vendors abandoned their stalls. Townspeople rushed forward, some trying to douse the flames with buckets of water, others pulling at the ropes in a futile attempt to collapse the tent before it spread further. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the big top was already a skeletal frame of charred wood, collapsing into embers. Survivors staggered out with burns, coughing up black smoke, their clothes singed. Parents screamed for children lost in the crush, their voices drowned by the crackle of flames. The ringmaster was last seen shouting orders, coat aflame, before vanishing into the smoke. In less than 20 minutes, the carnival's greatest attraction had transformed into a mass grave. The official count that night listed dozens dead, many more injured, with others missing entirely. The newspapers called it a tragedy, an accident, one more entry in the long ledger of carnival fires that plagued mid-century America. But in the crowd of ash and grief, there were murmurs. Some survivors swore the flames hadn't started from the lantern at all, but from multiple points at once. Others claimed they had seen someone splashing liquid along the canvas just before the fire caught. And then there were the families who noticed the numbers didn't add up. Children who had been seated together, but only some of whom were recovered. Travelers whose names appeared on carnival payroll, but whose bodies were never found. For the town, grief was enough. For investigators, the fire was filed away as an accident. But in time, evidence would surface that not everyone in that tent had died from flame or smoke. Some had been dead long before the fire ever began. When the last embers of the fire cooled, the charred skeleton of the big top was hauled away. The carnival moved on, and the fairground was left to grass and silence. For decades, the site remained little more than a scar on the town's memory, an open field where children dared each other to sneak at night, whispering about screams still carried on the wind. Officially, the fire was written into history as a tragic accident. Families buried what bodies they could recover. Others clung to the word missing and tried to convince themselves their loved ones had escaped somehow, slipping into another town with the carnival. Time dulled the headlines, but never the unease. It wasn't until the late 1990s, nearly 40 years after the disaster, that the past clawed its way back into the present. Developers had purchased the land, eager to clear it for a shopping complex. Bulldozers dug deep into the soil, grinding through layers of ash and charred wood. At first, the workers weren't surprised. Old fire debris was expected. But one morning, as the blade of a machine cut into the earth, it uncovered something far more disturbing. A cluster of bones, not fossilized, not ancient, but human. The machines stopped. Crews called police. Soon the site was cordoned off with yellow tape as forensic teams in white suits picked through the dirt. What they found was not consistent with victims of a fire. These bones bore no signs of charring or heat damage. Instead, some showed fractures to the skull, blunt force trauma delivered long before the blaze. Others had ligature marks on wrists and ankles, as though tied. One skeleton was missing its skull entirely, and another still had a knife lodged between its ribs. The conclusion was inescapable. These people hadn't died in the fire at all. They had been murdered, their bodies hidden in the chaos of the blaze. The fire had been a cover, a grand finale designed to erase evidence beneath ash and canvas. Investigators reopened the case, digging deeper into old archives, pulling brittle photographs and faded witness statements from the police vault. Survivors were tracked down, now elderly, some reluctant to remember, others breaking down as they described details they had buried for decades. One woman recalled seeing a clown backstage before the fire, his costume smeared with something dark she'd thought was soot. Another man remembered the strong smell of kerosene moments before the tent went up. Though the official report had blamed a lantern, the bones kept surfacing as excavations continued. Dozens of fragments scattered across the site, some burned, some pristine, all mismatched to the official death toll. Personal artifacts emerged too: a locket engraved with initials, a child's shoe, a carnival badge belonging to a missing roustabout. Forensic testing revealed many belonged to people never listed among the fire's victims, suggesting the death count had been manipulated from the start. The revelation shook the town. What had once been framed as tragic accident now looked like conspiracy. The carnival hadn't simply lost control of fire. Someone had used the flames to hide a massacre. Questions flooded back with urgency. Who had lit the blaze? Who were the victims buried in the dirt? And how many others had disappeared into the carnival's shadows without a trace? The site that was meant to become a shopping center was abandoned, fenced off once again. This time not out of superstition, but as a crime scene frozen in time. Reporters swarmed, dubbing it the Carnival of Ashes. Families of the long missing demanded exhumations and answers. And police, staring at bones unearthed 40 years too late, realized they weren't investigating a fire anymore. They were chasing a murderer who had danced under the big top, hiding behind painted faces, turning spectacle into slaughter. They came to the station in slow waves, stooped backs, careful steps, voices worn thin by time. Some arrived clutching yellowed clippings, others with nothing but a memory they'd tried not to think about for 40 years. Detectives cleared a conference room and set a carafe of coffee on a table that had seen 100 ordinary interviews, but never anything like this. The sign on the door read, "Witness Intake." But to everyone who crossed the threshold, it felt more like confession. The first to speak was Agnes Bell, a former popcorn girl who had been 16 the summer the carnival burned. She kept her eyes on her hands as she described the moments before the blaze. A commotion behind the menagerie, two roustabouts arguing in low, tight voices, and the ringmaster, Victor Vale, stepping between them with a smile too wide for the situation. He said, "Save it for the finale," Agnes whispered. "I thought he meant the high-wire act." He winked like it was a joke. It wasn't a joke, was it? Detectives slid a photograph across the table. Vale in a crimson coat, hat tipped rakishly. The very image of a showman. Agnes nodded without touching it. "He always smelled like bay rum and lamp oil," she said, and a note-taker circled the words lamp oil twice. Next came Ruthie Calder, once billed as the half-girl fire queen, a sideshow performer whose act involved tracing sparks along her forearm without burning. The years had turned her voice flinty. "Accidents happen," she said, "but not from 3 places at once." She described the canvas catching on the east seam, the west corner glowing a heartbeat later, then the center pole haloing in flame as if on cue. "You don't get that from a lantern," she said. "You get that from someone painting the air with fuel." The detectives listened and built a clock. If there were 3 starts, there had to be 3 hands. They tracked down Emmett Doyle, the clown children knew as Patches, now a widower in a boarding house by the freight yard. His hands shook as he laced his fingers together, knuckles stained a permanent gray from grease paint ground into his skin decades ago. "I saw Ike," he said finally. "Isaac Moreno, a rigger, good man, strong. He was hauling a drum behind the back line where we kept the feed for the goats, except we didn't keep drums there. He shouldn't have had one." Emmett's voice shrank. "I should have asked. We mind our own, Carney code. You understand?" He stared past the detectives to a poster peeling on the opposite wall. "He didn't come out after. Ike. He's on your list, isn't he?" He was. The missing roster from 1958 had grown longer since the dig. Not only townsfolk and ticket holders, but carnies whose names were inked on payroll one day and erased by fire the next. The investigators found a different angle in the city archive. A stack of brittle fairground permits and a ledger labeled Bali Book in looping ink. The week of the fire, the schedule included a new late-night draw. The Mirror Illusion, one night only. No performer was listed beside it. In the margin, a note. Insurance rider in hand, VV. The city clerk who had stamped the permit remembered Vale well. "Charmed the teeth from a saint," he said. The rider, it turned out, had tripled the coverage on the big top for that single week. When the detectives tracked Madame Rosina, the fortune teller whose eyes had once given children chills, they found her in a narrow apartment heavy with incense and stacking tea tins. Her gaze was still knife-sharp. "You think I didn't warn them?" she asked. "I told Victor the cards were all fire and debt." He laughed. She described a man, tall, with a limp, arguing with Vale 2 nights before the blaze, threatening to tell the sheriff what's in the wagons. Rosina lowered her voice. "Not animals, not costumes. What we hauled between towns to pay the road." The word pay hung between them. The carnival was famous for its games of chance and the quiet tax of the midway, a coin skim that greased officials and kept questions away. Blackmail could travel faster than a Ferris wheel. From a rest home across the county came Owen Pike, a retired volunteer fireman who had been 19 that night. He brought a dog-eared notebook, the kind a young man carries to feel official. On the first page was a crude map of hose runs and hydrants, and in the corner, a sketch of the big top with 3 X's. "We marked origin points on anything big," he said, tapping the X's. "We learned this from barn fires. The way canvas goes, you can read a story backward." That night had 3 starts, and the wind wasn't right for it. But the insurance man was already on scene before the last pole fell. Never seen that in my life. He chuckled without humor. He knew where to stand to stay clean. Detectives pulled thread after thread. In a box of personal effects donated to the Historical Society years earlier, they found a seamstress's notebook. Dela Cruz had mended costumes for the troupe. Between dress patterns and hem measurements were receipts for canvas patches, and a separate column with a different hand. Pitch varnish, 2 tins. Terp, 4. Paid cash. VV. 2 days before the fire. A carny-turned-carpenter, Sammy Nails DeLuca, added another piece. He remembered a stranger the crew called the Night Man. Not a performer, not a rigger, just a quiet figure Vale kept near after dark. "Did odd jobs," Sammy said. "Shifting wagons at midnight, tightening ropes, minding the money man's door, walked with a limp, wore a coat even in July. The description matched Rosina's limping man. No one remembered a last name. Carnivals collected men like that, arrivals at dusk who left no footprints by dawn. Across interviews, a pattern hardened. Fuel drums moved where they didn't belong, a tight-lipped outsider, an insurance policy fattened like a calf, a ringmaster smiling too wide, and yet each witness carried regret like a pocket knife turned inward. "We don't tell on our own," Emmett whispered at the end of his interview. "Even when our own ain't right." He took the detective's card anyway and set it carefully under his glass as if trapping a moth. Not every whisper pointed the same direction. Becker, the animal trainer, wrote back from a roadside attraction in Oklahoma to say Vale was a showman but not a killer. He blamed a jealous young lion tamer fired the week before. Pearl Haven, once the snake charmer, insisted the fortune teller started the blaze for the insurance and framed Vale with her insinuations. Old loyalties turned the air into a hall of mirrors, every face a reflection of a reflection, the truth a wobbling line between. Then a small, strange voice cut through. Detectives tracked down Tommy Nash, 60 now, who had been a runaway working as a candy butcher in '58. One of the kids who threaded through the bleachers hawking sweets. He met them at a diner, palms flat on the formica to stop their trembling. "I snuck under the seats," he said. "Best way to sell fast. I saw Mr. Vale's shoes." He smiled weakly. "I didn't forget 'em. Red leather. Who else had red shoes?" He described watching those shoes stop at a seam where canvas met pole and the way the coattails hit emotion, arm up, arm down, like painting a fence that wasn't there. "I smelled something sharp," he said. "Not lamp oil, something like the garage." He didn't know the word kerosene at 13. He knows it now. In the records room at City Hall, beneath a squeaking fan, an intern found a torn page in the Carnival's internal ledger, Vale's own hand listing times. 8:00 opening, 8:07 cats, 8:12 mirror illusion, 8:15 finale. The Carnival had no fireworks. The act listed as mirror illusion had no billing. On the same page, in pencil, was a tiny notation beside 8:15, a single letter, smudged but legible, N. Nightman? Nash? No one could say. Detectives built timelines and fed them to the new forensic story the dirt had told. Victims bound or struck before flame, a trio of origin points, a policy plumped with a fresh rider, a stranger with a limp, a ringmaster at the seam. Motive teased itself forward. Debt, blackmail, the Carnival's greasy coins owed to men who had grown tired of small money. Fire as a ledger's eraser, fire as a curtain call. At dusk, when interviews were done and the day's notes lay bleeding ink across legal pads, one detective walked the old fairground fence alone. There was nothing to see, just grass and a windbreak of poplars. But in the mind's eye, the tent still stood, swelling with applause. The detectives couldn't yet name the hand that struck the match, but the whispers had changed something fundamental. The Carnival fire no longer looked like a single night of panic. It looked like a plan rehearsed through a week of accidents, choreographed by someone who understood that spectacle is the best shield of all. In the morning, they would subpoena the insurance underwriter and chase the nightman across old show routes, sketched on cocktail napkins and the backs of posters. Tonight, they had the first clean shape of a truth the town had been too dazzled to see. The big top hadn't simply caught fire. It had been set. And under its blazing canvas lay not the chaos of chance, but the choreography of murder. The deeper the investigation pushed, the more the spotlight swung toward the one man whose face was everywhere in the old photographs. Victor Vale, ringmaster, impresario, salesman of wonder. In the posters saved by collectors, he loomed larger than his lions, standing center stage in a crimson coat, grinning beneath a tall black hat as though he personally commanded the magic of the Midway. To the crowds, he was the carnival. To those who had worked under him, he was equal parts father figure, tyrant, and magician of manipulation. Detectives combed through Vale's surviving paper trail. His personal accounts had long since gone cold, but the fragments that remained hinted at debts to men in cities the carnival passed through. Fees written off as permits or special rentals. Each time the carnival reappeared in the record, it was leaner. Animals sold off, wagons in disrepair, payroll trimmed. By the summer of 1958, Vale was running on fumes. The insurance rider uncovered in the city's archives, the one that tripled the payout on the big top, looked less like routine caution and more like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Interviews with surviving performers painted Vale as a man who never dropped his smile, even when fists were flying behind the tents. He could shout without raising his voice, said one acrobat. You'd find yourself nodding before you realized he'd given you an order. Others described the pressure he exerted: fines for late cues, silent deductions from wages, the occasional beating disguised as discipline. The show must go on, he always said. It was both command and threat. The whispers gathered by detectives began to converge. Multiple witnesses remembered seeing Vale in places that didn't make sense. By the lamp lines minutes before the blaze, near supply wagons where drums of kerosene shouldn't have been, shouting orders that contradicted each other. A fireman's report noted Vale's body was never recovered. Some claimed he died in the flames, a martyr to his own hubris. Others insisted they saw him outside after the tent collapsed, his coat scorched but intact, vanishing into the crowd. The missing body became the investigation's most stubborn ghost. Without remains, Vale could never be crossed off the suspect list, and without proof, neither could he be declared guilty. Yet the circumstantial evidence piled higher than the bleachers once had. He had the motive: debts, blackmail, a carnival teetering on ruin. He had the opportunity: control of the grounds, access to every corner, the authority to silence questions. And he had the flair. If Vale were to end his show, wouldn't he do it with fire, spectacle, and the illusion of tragedy? But detectives also had to contend with Vale's defenders. A handful of aging performers swore the ringmaster was no killer, only a desperate man caught in the wrong place. They blamed the so-called night man, the limping outsider who shadowed Vale in those final weeks. Perhaps Vale, they argued, had been set up, framed by the very man he trusted to guard the wagons. Perhaps the reason his body was never found was because he had already been among the dead before the fire began. Theories spiraled, mirroring the circular path of the circus itself. Vale as mastermind, Vale as scapegoat, Vale as ghost who slipped into anonymity. Detectives chasing his trail found tantalizing scraps: an insurance check cashed in a distant city under an alias, a man in a crimson coat sighted at a train platform years later, a ledger of show routes with the final page torn away. Each clue pulled the story in a different direction. What remained undeniable was Vale's shadow. Whether architect or victim, his presence dominated every account. Survivors still saw his grin in nightmares, heard his voice booming above the music. "Step right up, ladies and gentlemen." As the investigation pressed on, the question hardened into a riddle the city couldn't answer. Was Victor Vale the ringmaster of a massacre, or merely the last trick of the carnival's greatest illusionist? He was everywhere and nowhere in the old memories, present in the corners of photographs, named in a dozen ways, but never with a surname that stuck. The performers called him the Night Man because that's when he appeared, when the wagons were locked and the moneyman's door clicked shut, when Victor Vale's grin turned thin and practical and the business of the carnival took place out of sight of the midway lights. Some said he limped because of a rigging accident. Others swore he'd come back from the war with shrapnel in his hip. He wore a dark coat even in July. He smoked unfiltered cigarettes down to the paper. He kept his hands in his pockets when men raised theirs. Detectives began with the fragments. In the Bally book, the carnival's internal schedule, mirror illusion was penciled beside 8:12 the night of the fire, then crossed out. Next to 8:15 finale, someone had written a single letter, N. A seamstress's notebook listed last-minute purchases in a different hand. Pitch varnish, 2 tins. Turpentine, 4. Paid cash. VV, a week's payroll from the same crate showed a day labor line marked only night, 4 evenings in a row. Cash, no initials. Vale's checkmark squashed beside it like a stamp of approval. The carnival language was plain. The Night Man didn't exist in daylight. Witnesses colored him in. Sammy Nails DeLuca, who had once bolted the poles and tightened the guy ropes, said the Night Man kept the hours of a stagehand and the duties of a fixer. If there was a quarrel, he walked a man off the lot, Sammy said. If a sheriff wanted his palm warmed, Night Man's the one did the warming. If the route boss said a wagon moved after midnight, Night Man found the team and did it. He had keys to locks we didn't have. Madame Rosina remembered his limp. Left leg, she said. He dragged it a little. Not enough to slow him, enough to make you watch his hands instead of his feet. Emmett Doyle, Patches the Clown, remembered a drum where there should have been feed sacks. Ike Moreno was hauling it for him, Emmett said, shame in his voice. Ike didn't know. He did what he was told. A retired fireman's pocket notebook added a detail that suddenly mattered. Owen Pike had sketched 3 X's to mark the tent's origins of flame. In the margin, a younger Owen had scribbled, "Strange track in ash. Cain." The lad had thought himself poetic. Decades later, the mark read like a footnote from a witness who didn't yet know he'd been one. If the Night Man was real, he had to have a past that could be followed. Detectives stepped off the carnival lot and onto the route, the long ribbon of towns where the show had wintered and returned. Evansville, Rome, the American one, Joliet, Galesburg, Paragould, and a dozen river towns where a man could arrive and vanish in the smoke of the train. In Evansville, a city archivist produced a stack of railroad bunkhouse registers from the 1950s. Among the names was a careful hand, N. Hart, twice in July, once in September, paying cash, requesting a lower bunk near the stove. In Joliet, a VA nurse, now 85 and sharp as a tack, remembered a man who came to her clinic with a hip that sang in the rain. Wouldn't give a last name, she said. But soldiers tell you in other ways. He did the army slouch, walked like he'd learned to make pain sound like nothing. None of it was a proof. All of it was a shape. At the Historical Society, a volunteer unfurled a panoramic publicity photo salvaged from a shuttered print shop. A long sweep of the Midway taken an hour before the first show on the fatal night. There was Vale in his crimson coat, hat off to the crowd, palms up in welcome. There were the aerialists in warm-up jackets. There was the cat cage, the wagons, the lamp lines snaking like veins, and at the far edge, almost lost in the blur where the lens ran out of breath, a tall man in a dark coat, leaned with one shoulder against a pole, his face turned away, one leg set at an angle too stiff to be casual. A magnifier brought the image up until the grain broke into dots. On the ground beside that awkward foot, the nub of a cane tip pressed into soft dirt. Forensics returned to the dig site with a new question. In the ash and soil outside the ring line, where the fire's heat had licked but not sterilized everything, techs sifted for metal that wasn't nail or staple. They found a scatter of small, round impressions, hard as pebbles, the size of a cane ferrule, leading from the seam by the east rope row to the lamp line manifold at the back, then again from the west quarter pole toward the feed wagons. The prints were broken by boot scuffs and the chaotic map of panic. But once you saw the pattern, it couldn't be unseen. A triangle of visits, east, west, center, each at the places where the blaze had bloomed. The accelerant analysis, performed on preserved soil cores the developers hadn't destroyed, had already told a quiet truth. Kerosene in intermittent ribbons, not a single spill, painted in arcs as if with a mop. The nightman's limp made a macabre sense of it. An injured man might favor a long-handled rag, sweeping in curves, working by muscle and leverage, not by speed. The riggers had a tool for waterproofing canvas, a pole with a swab bound to its end. You could paint a tent in an hour with one of those, Sammy DeLuca said when shown a photograph. You could paint anything. Money tied them. Subpoenas pried loose the insurance file on Vale's rider. The beneficiary wasn't a person, but a shell, traveling exhibition holdings, a checking account that eluded the first round of searches until an old bank officer's ledger revealed a one-time endorsement to bearer, cashed 3 weeks after the fire at a branch 2 towns down the line. The teller, long retired, remembered only a detail that lodged like a seed. He used his left hand for everything, but signed with his right. The right was neat. The left carried the cane. Detectives resisted the leap. Plenty of men used canes. Plenty limped. But the ledger with its penciled N, the bunkhouse registers with N. Heart, the teller's memory. The cane-tipped track in old ash, the kerosene arcs, the cash day labor line marked night, the publicity photo's shadow figure, all conspired toward the same silhouette. A man trusted with the tent after dark, who had the access, the time, and the quiet to paint fire where it would do the most harm. Motive bent back to Vale. Blackmail was the carnival's plague and its oxygen. Madame Rosina had spoken of a limping man threatening to tell the sheriff what's in the wagons. If the nightman had Vale cornered, if debts had piled, if the road money was short, then fire solved 3 problems at once. It erased ledgers, it reset the payroll to 0, and, if the rider paid, someone walked away with the one infusion of cash the carnival had left. Whether that someone was Vale, the nightman, or both, remained the question. A different set of whispers suggested a darker trade. Dela Cruz, the seamstress whose notebook had held the pitch and turpentine purchase, remembered mending a coat that week, the nightman's, its inside pocket torn, its lining stiff with something that made her hands stink for hours. He didn't want me to keep it overnight, she said. Waited in the doorway while I stitched. I told him it was too hot for wool. He said, "Night's colder than you think." Detectives did what investigators do when the living provide only shadows. They looked for paper that didn't lie. In the Veterans Archives, an application turned up for a man with an old hip injury, initialed NH, who sought civilian night watch work on a state fairground the autumn after the carnival burned. In the margin, a clerk had written references: traveling show, ringmaster VV. The application had been withdrawn without explanation. 2 months later, a Noah Hartley signed into a rooming house 3 blocks from that fairground. He left after 1 week, paying cash, walking out before dawn. It was enough for a name to stick in a report, not enough for a charge. The detectives added Noah Hartley, alias, to the board. A line from his name to Vale's, another to the word kerosene, a third to N in the ledger. They drew 3 small X's in the corner of the whiteboard, the same triangle a 19-year-old fireman had sketched in pencil 4 decades before. They kept looking for a body. If the nightman had died in the tent, he would be in the ash with the others. But the unearthed bones had already told a separate story. Some victims had been dead before the first flame, bound wrists, broken skulls, and among the recovered were at least 2 Carney laborers who had crossed Vale in the week prior. The nightman's job had included walking men off the lot. What if he'd walked them farther? What if the fire was not only a cover for arson, but a curtain to hide murder done slowly across days? Debts collected with a club, quarrels settled with rope. By the end of the month, the nightman had a file thick enough to feel like certainty. It wasn't. There was no confession, no photograph of his hand on a match, no single witness brave enough to swear he'd seen him slick the seams. What the detectives had instead was the shape of a man who fit the fire like a key fits a lock. The limp, the cane, the coat. The payroll entries that called him into being only when the sun went down. The triangle of steps between the places where the tent bloomed like a cruel flower. Back at the old grounds, wind combed the grass where the center pole once bit the earth. A detective stood where the ring had been and eyed the distances. East seam, west seam, center line. Even with a limp, a man with a plan and a pole could paint those arcs in minutes and be gone by the time the crowd leaned forward for the cats. From the right place, you could watch spectacle become cover. From the wrong place, you'd call it fate. The nightman remained what he'd always been, a worker of necessary evils who knew that under the big top, the end of the show comes fast, and most people are looking up. Whether he had lit the match for himself, for his ringmaster, or to erase both their ledgers at once, the detectives could not yet say. But the shadow he cast had finally taken a name and a path, and both led back to the painted smile at the center of the ring. The forensic teams returned to the ground where the big top had once stood, armed with tools the firemen of 1958 never had. Sifters shook the soil into trays, magnets swept the dirt for fragments of metal, and chemical sprays coaxed invisible stains to bloom under ultraviolet light. For decades, the site had been written off as a graveyard of ash, but modern science whispered louder than the flames ever had. What they uncovered told a story sharper than any survivor's memory. The fire was only the last act. Bones lifted from the soil carried messages in silence. Some were pale and cracked with heat, but others had never known fire. A femur bore a spiral fracture from twisting force, not flame. A clavicle had been broken clean by a blunt strike. One jawbone still carried the neat, circular hole of a bullet. The lead lodged inside, sealed away from oxygen by layers of dirt. These were not the wounds of panic or stampede. They were the deliberate signatures of violence. The fire had not killed everyone beneath the big top. It had hidden them. Personal items added their own testimony. A child's locket surfaced intact, its chain broken not by heat, but by a sharp tug. A pocket watch was stopped at 8:14 p.m., the very minute before the fire spread. In its gears, soot was absent. It had been shielded from flame, perhaps buried already. A woman's shoe was found with both straps cut, as though removed from her body after death. Investigators began to realize they weren't cataloging fire victims. They were unearthing a burial ground. Soil chemistry gave the strongest clue. Samples tested positive for kerosene, not in the broad spillage of an accident, but in curved, repeating arcs, as if someone had walked the tent's perimeter painting fuel into the canvas. The arcs converged at 3 points. The same triangle fireman Owen Pike had drawn as X's in his boyish notebook 4 decades earlier. What once looked like speculation now stood as confirmation. The fire had 3 origins by human hand. The bodies, at least 30 newly confirmed, didn't align with the official death toll. Old records claimed 54 casualties. Forensic teams now counted more than 70. Who were the extra victims? Their skeletons carried carnival badges, roustabout boots, jewelry too plain to belong to paying customers. It looked as though some of the dead were carnival folk themselves, silenced with the same brutality as outsiders. One particularly grisly find came from beneath a charred beam. 2 sets of bones intermingled, one small, one large, their hands bound together at the wrist by wire that had fused under heat. The bindings were applied before the fire. The marks on bone showed. This was no accident. No panicked crowd clutching each other. This was staging. The detective in charge whispered to his recorder. They wanted them found this way, even in ash. Historians combing through photographs of the carnival's final week found images that now looked sinister. Roustabouts moving barrels too large for lamp oil, Vale adjusting a rope near the seam later marked as a flashpoint, the nightman in his coat, his limp foot angled toward a supply wagon. The past was beginning to speak in chorus. And then there was the matter of teeth. Forensic odontologists compared dental fragments with the files of missing townsfolk. Some matched children who had been declared dead in the fire. Others belonged to men never listed as victims at all. Local debt collectors, a sheriff's deputy who'd investigated carnival skims, a drifter who had threatened Vale over unpaid wages. They hadn't burned in chaos. They had been silenced and placed where the fire could wash them into legend. The Carnival of Ashes, once remembered as tragedy, now stood revealed as massacre. Investigators stared at the spread of evidence on their boards. Kerosene arcs, broken bones, bound wrists, bullets lodged in skulls, a ledger fat with insurance, and a ringmaster who had either perished in the smoke or slipped away into history's blind spots. The nightman's cane marks in the soil became the punctuation to the story, each one a reminder that someone had walked calmly through the chaos, tracing arcs of flame while the crowd believed the show was still underway. The ash no longer lied. It spoke of planning, of staging, of debts settled with blood. And the most terrifying truth was this: the fire that ended the carnival had not been the disaster. It had been the cover. From the first day the flames were extinguished, silence wrapped itself around the carnival like another tent, one stitched not of canvas, but of fear, money, and complicity. In 1958, towns lived and died on commerce, and a carnival fire that killed scores was scandal enough without whispers of murder. Officials called it an unfortunate accident. Insurance adjusters wrote their checks and closed their books. The newspapers ran photographs of grieving families, but none printed the inconsistencies in body counts or the eyewitness who insisted he saw men splashing fuel before the blaze. The cover story was too neat, too convenient, and too profitable to be questioned. Detectives digging decades later found correspondence that confirmed what survivors had always suspected. The silence wasn't ignorance, it was arrangement. A yellowed letter from the state fire marshal to the mayor's office read, "Recommend closing file. no benefit to extended inquiry. Carnival insurers will cooperate if death totals remain consistent with filed claim. Attached was a typed list of approved fatalities, 54 names neatly arranged, some of whom had no relatives to verify their deaths. In effect, the town had agreed to set the number in stone, no matter what reality said. The insurance company had its reasons. The rider Vale had purchased, tripling coverage for that week, should have raised eyebrows, yet the payout was approved in record time. Investigators later discovered that the underwriter assigned to the case had himself been linked to Carnival syndicates, accused of laundering money through traveling shows. In his private notes, scrawled in pencil, was one chilling phrase: "Better to lose tenths than lose face." Carnival insiders also bore responsibility. Performers and workers lived by an unspoken creed: Carny folk don't talk to outsiders. That code, forged in decades of distrust, became a prison of silence. Many had seen drums where they shouldn't be, heard Vale's quiet threats, watched the nightman's limp figure vanish behind wagons carrying more than sawdust and props. But none came forward. Fear of losing the only life they knew outweighed loyalty to truth. As one retired acrobat put it years later, "If the carnival burned, we rebuilt. If men died, we buried them in the road." That's how it was. Even the townsfolk played a part. The fire had devastated families, but it had also brought federal relief funds and attention that helped rebuild crumbling infrastructure. The mayor, faced with choosing between scandal or survival, chose silence. Families who questioned the narrative found themselves pushed aside, their grief written off as hysteria. Mothers demanding answers were told to let the dead rest. Fathers who pressed too hard were warned about their own mortgages and livelihoods. A few left town altogether, unable to live in a place that had chosen forgetting over truth. Over the years, the silence calcified. High school history lessons referred to the tragedy as the Carnival Fire, never the Carnival of Ashes. Local guides avoided the fairground entirely. Survivors who tried to speak out found doors closed and reputations questioned. By the time the bones resurfaced in the 1990s, the conspiracy had lasted so long, it felt like part of the town's identity. We do not speak of the carnival, but silence leaves traces. In attics and trunks, fragments survived, playbills with names later missing, diaries that mentioned strange men watching the wagons, faded receipts for bulk kerosene purchased under aliases. Each scrap chipped away at the facade. Investigators pieced together a chilling realization. The conspiracy of silence had not been a single decision, but a network of small, complicit choices. By the mayor who filed away a report, the underwriter who signed a check, the roustabout who looked away, the fireman who swallowed doubt, and the townsfolk who let memory sink into ash. The silence had preserved the carnival's secrets for decades, but when the earth gave them back, it spoke louder than any official report. The bones said what the living would not. This had never been an accident. It had been murder disguised as tragedy, and the silence afterward had been just another layer of the cover. Even after the ash was scraped away and the bones boxed into evidence, the town could not free itself from the carnival. It lingered like smoke clinging to curtains long after the fire is gone. Generations who had never set foot inside the big top still spoke of it in whispers, their childhoods shadowed by stories older than themselves. Every town has its legends. This one had a wound that never healed. Children dared each other to run across the abandoned fairground at dusk, where grass grew taller than knees and broken boards poked up like ribs. They said if you listened carefully, You could hear calliope music beneath the crickets, faint and sour, like a tune played on warped pipes. Others swore that if you stood in the center of the field at midnight, you would smell kerosene. Parents dismissed it as imagination, but many locked their doors tighter when the summer anniversary rolled around. The silence that had served the conspiracy now bred superstition. Families who lost someone in the fire, those who had buried coffins filled with nothing but ash, held vigils in private, candles flickering behind drawn curtains. They taught their children not to trust carnivals, not to step inside tents, not to laugh at painted clowns. As decades passed, the tragedy became folklore, the carnival that ate its own. Teenagers whispered about a limping man with a cane who walked the edges of the field, his shadow longer than the fence line. Economically, the curse was real enough. Businesses near the old site failed again and again, no matter the owners. Shops couldn't hold tenants. Even when developers proposed a shopping center, locals resisted, not out of respect for the dead, but out of fear that whatever haunted the ground would taint commerce. By the time the bones were uncovered in the 1990s, the land was regarded as poisoned. Realtors didn't list homes within sight of the fence. Children grew up hearing parents say, "We don't build there." Psychologically, the fire had burned a brand into the town's soul. Survivors who lived into old age carried their nightmares with them, murmuring in nursing homes about screams under canvas, about red shoes that left no ashes. Some confessed on their deathbeds things they had held inside for decades. Sightings of Vale alive after the fire, glimpses of men bound before the blaze, the name Nightman whispered like a curse. But their words came too late, half erased by years of denial, easy for skeptics to dismiss. The carnival's shadow even shaped how the town treated newcomers. Outsiders who arrived with wagons or traveling shows were shunned. Flyers for circuses were torn down. When one modern carnival attempted to rent the fairground in the early 2000s, protests erupted, with old men carrying placards that read, "No big tops here." Children who had grown up on the legends refused to go, too frightened of inheriting ghosts they'd never met. Haunting isn't always supernatural. Sometimes it's the weight of memory pressed so deep it warps the living. For this town, the Carnival of Ashes was not a story locked in books. It was a presence underfoot, stitched into the soil. Farmers swore their plows struck bone near the fairground. Hikers claimed their lanterns sputtered out near the fence. A local pastor held midnight prayers on anniversaries, not sanctioned by any church, but attended by those who wanted to believe words could keep fire from rising again. Even in culture, the fire became a specter. Amateur filmmakers shot documentaries. Podcasters whispered over static. Horror novelists set stories in towns just like this one, where a tent rose in dreams and laughter turned to screams. But for the people who lived there, no story could compete with reality. Dozens dead, others murdered before the blaze, and a ringmaster and his nightman who might never have perished at all. The town was haunted not by ghosts, but by unfinished business. Too many bodies missing, too many questions unanswered, too many men who had profited from the silence. And when the earth gave back its secrets, the haunting grew sharper, no longer just folklore, but forensic fact. What had been whispered in alleys and kitchens was now carved into bone. The carnival had been murder. And so every time the wind blew across the fairground grass, rattling the fence like applause, the town remembered. You cannot bury fire, you cannot silence ash, and you cannot tell a community to forget when the ground itself will not let them. The Carnival of Ashes never truly belonged only to the town where it happened. Over time, its shadow spilled beyond county lines, across state borders, and into the bloodstream of culture itself. What began as a local disaster grew into a national cautionary tale, retold in documentaries, whispered in criminology classes, dissected in law enforcement training seminars. The fire that once seemed like an accident had, with the revelations of murder, become a parable of fear, of how spectacle hides violence, how silence preserves crime, and how the truth eventually claws its way back into daylight. Police academies began including the case in their curricula. Trainees studied the forensic mistakes of 1958, how investigators failed to recognize multiple ignition points, how bodies with obvious pre-fire trauma were misclassified as fire victims, how the insurance payout was rushed through without scrutiny. Instructors told cadets, "Look twice at every tragedy, ask who profits." To new generations of investigators, the Carnival of Ashes became a textbook in negligence, corruption, and the deadly price of assumption. For the public, the legacy was different, more primal, more visceral. The carnival, once a symbol of innocence, of laughter beneath a striped tent, began to carry a darker meaning. Parents who had grown up hearing the whispers refused to let their children attend traveling shows. Carny became a word edged with suspicion. Clowns, already objects of unease for many, became terrifying symbols of deceit, smiling masks that could hide killers. The burned big top was no longer just a ruin. It was a cultural warning. Joy can turn to terror in a heartbeat. Artists, filmmakers, and writers seized the imagery. Horror films borrowed from the carnival fire, tents collapsing in flames, audiences screaming beneath falling canvas, painted faces staring out of smoke. Podcasters explored the conspiracy, their voices dropping to a hush as they recited witness testimony of the nightman's limp or Vale's red shoes. True crime authors painted the fire as part of a broader American Gothic, a reminder that beneath the neon and laughter of mid-century spectacle, rot and cruelty could thrive. Even scholars found resonance. Sociologists cited the case as an example of collective denial, how communities suppress painful truths to preserve identity. Anthropologists pointed to the way folklore had absorbed fact, how ghost stories about music in the grass were simply the town's subconscious refusing to let go. Historians noted the carnival's eerie parallel with disasters in other entertainment venues, the theater fires, the circus infernos, and how often officials, insurance men, and businessmen rushed to frame them as accidents, never crimes. But the most lasting legacy was fear, the kind that seeps into places it doesn't belong. Children grew up with it, not just in the town but across regions where the story spread. They learned to mistrust tents, to eye exits in crowded spaces, to wonder what lay behind spectacle. The Carnival of Ashes became shorthand in everyday language. Parents might warn, "Don't get caught in a carnival fire," meaning don't be distracted by illusions while danger grows around you. Lawyers, too, cited the case when fighting for fire code reforms. "Remember the Carnival of Ashes," one attorney thundered in a courtroom debate about exit regulations. The phrase became a mantra in safety circles. Never again should a crowd die in ignorance while officials look the other way. Yet for all the lessons taught, the case remained unresolved at its core. Vale's body was never found. The nightman's true identity never pinned down. The conspiracy's architects never named. That unsolved element gave the fire a second life, an unfinished story that encouraged every generation to reinterpret it, to project new fears into its smoke. In that way, The Carnival of Ashes was less a crime and more a mirror, reflecting the anxieties of whoever looked into it. Even today, more than half a century later, the legacy clings. Tourists still drive by the overgrown lot, taking photographs through the chain-link fence. Teachers still caution students to read between the lines of official reports. Podcasters still retell the story with new spins, new theories, new suspects. The carnival burned only once, but the fear it left behind burns endlessly, flickering in memory, in culture, in the human instinct to distrust what glitters too brightly. The Carnival of Ashes proved a truth as enduring as bone. Fire destroys, but it also reveals. And sometimes the ashes left behind are not just reminders of what was lost, but warnings of what still lurks unseen. When the investigation closed for the second time, this time not as accident, but as massacre, it left more questions sealed in boxes than answers written in ink. The ash had spoken, the bones had testified, but the most important figures remained shadows. Victor Vale, the smiling ringmaster, was never recovered, never proven dead, never proven alive. Some swore he perished in the fire, his red coat swallowed by smoke. Others insisted they saw him after, coat scorched, hat missing, slipping through the crowd before vanishing forever. To this day, his name remains on two lists at once: victim and suspect. The Nightman, too, refused to be pinned down. Investigators found hints, aliases scrawled in bunkhouse ledgers, cane tips pressed into soil, payroll entries written in Vale's hand, but no definitive body, no arrest, no closure. If he was real, if his name truly was Noah Hartley or something else entirely, he left no grave to visit, no fingerprints in the files. Like a ghost conjured only in whispers, he existed precisely where certainty ended. The victims, the true heart of the story, were denied justice in life and clarity in death. Their bones were boxed and catalogued, some returned to families, others left unclaimed. Many remain nameless, silent reminders that not all the carnival's secrets were unearthed. For every locket, shoe, or watch identified, there were fragments that belonged to no record, to no missing person ever reported. It is possible, even likely, that some who vanished beneath the big top had been erased long before the fire began, their disappearances folded into the carnival's traveling silence. The conspiracy, too, will never be fully untangled. Letters and ledgers showed collusion between officials, insurers, and carnival insiders, but many of the names have long since turned to dust. Men who profited from silence went to their graves unpunished. Families who demanded answers were dismissed until death. The town that chose forgetting learned too late that silence does not erase, it only postpones. When the earth finally gave back its secrets, they were heavier than anyone had prepared for. What lingers now is not just history, but performance. Every retelling is another act in the carnival's final show. Documentaries frame Vale as mastermind or scapegoat, the Nightman as loyal henchman or true culprit. Podcasts turn evidence into cliffhangers. Tourists drive to the fenced-off field to snap photographs through chain link, their flashbulbs reflecting off the grass like ghostly fireflies. The carnival has burned for more than 60 years, not in flame, but in imagination. And perhaps that is the cruelest curtain call, that a massacre hidden in smoke became myth, that victims became footnotes in a story told for shivers, that the truth remains trapped in mirrors of speculation. The carnival was always about illusion, about directing eyes where the showman wanted them to look. Even in death, Vale may have succeeded in the greatest illusion of all, turning murder into mystery, truth into performance, horror into legend. But legends are dangerous things. They keep wounds from closing. They keep shadows alive. To this day, locals say that when the wind gusts across the fairground, rattling the fence like applause, you can hear echoes of the ringmaster's voice. "Step right up, ladies and gentlemen." Whether he burned in the blaze or slipped into the crowd, whether the nightman died in the ash or walked away with blood on his hands, whether the carnival fire was the finale of a desperate showman or the curtain rise of a conspiracy, we will never know. What we do know is this: the Carnival of Ashes was no accident. It was murder, staged beneath the stripes of a tent, and its show has never truly ended. Because some curtains fall not to close the story, but to make sure the audience keeps looking into the dark.